Hey everybody, welcome back to Tim Travels. I'm your host Terry. On my way home, I killed myself this week working the 3 whole days. Yeah, it's Thursday. What time is it? It's exactly 6 p.m. 1800. Just got finished up. Some of the places we run are kind of shutting down for the holiday anyway, but I only wanted to run. I thought I might be out till tomorrow morning, but we're going camping tomorrow, and I just wanted to get home as soon as possible, although do a little bit of work. So I'm going to get to Werner Enterprises, the world's worst trucking company, in a minute. And I'll tell you why I'm saying that about them. But first, I wanted to talk just briefly about a couple of things that have been on my mind. And, I don't get too wrapped around the axle about little stuff that the government does. I feel like there's just kind of this inertia to it all. But if you haven't been paying attention, the government of Qatar, but I think it's properly pronounced Gutter. They are giving a 747 to the United States to be outfitted as the new Air Force One. I'm not really sure why we need a new Air Force One. It seems like the one we have is pretty nice, but whatever. But in the halls of like bad ideas on several levels, this one is definitely up there when it comes to government ideas. And I gotta say that I just think Trump is enamored with planes, because if you recall, during his first administration, there was this big hubbub about Air Force One. Like, like normally presidents don't get in the weeds about stuff like that, but considering it's a tiny portion of the federal budget. But anyway, but let me just say this. I'm not going to get too deeply into why this decision is just incredibly stupid, to accept this plane from this foreign government. But really, by way of illustration, I would just remind people, or maybe commend to people to read about how the United States paid hundreds of millions of dollars, and I don't recall the total amount, to have an embassy, a new U.S. embassy built in Moscow. And this is probably 40 years ago now, maybe longer, that we never occupied, because we, as part of kind of international compact, we agreed to use Russian contractors, or contractors of the Soviet Union, because I think it was at least started when Russia was still part of the USSR. But what they had done is these contractors had implanted listening devices in all the walls that they constructed. And we, at some point, somebody, whether it was the State Department, the CIA, whoever, the Diplomatic Security Service, whoever, they realized what had happened. And so we basically had this enormous building built in Moscow and never occupied it, because we knew it was compromised. So if you think that, that happened to a building that we ostensibly were overseeing the construction of, I can't even imagine what interesting things would be built in or installed in this aircraft that we're being given. Now, people say, oh yeah, but we're going to tear it down, we're going to do this, we're going to do that, whatever. I still think it, and then just from a diplomatic standpoint, it's an absolutely horrible idea. First of all, just forget about diplomacy or security for a second. Just as a point of national pride, it makes us look like freaking beggars. Like, first of all, it's an airplane built by a U.S. company, and we're basically taking a handout. But politically, how it looks, or diplomatically how it looks, is, we're getting hooked up. Well, when somebody hooks you up, they don't do it for no reason, right? And I can't believe that our, quote, allies, the Israelis, don't think that this is a pretty bad idea, because, it just, it looks so bad on so many levels. It's wrong on so many levels, just, for any number of reasons. And if you think, oh, well, we got a good deal, we got this, I don't know how much that plane's worth, $500 million or whatever, for free. We saved the U.S. taxpayers. That's not what this is about. When you take anything from anybody that way, you subject yourself to all sorts of problems. It's like we can't stand on our own 2 feet. It's embarrassing. So that's that. The other thing I heard, and I don't know if this was just because, there are people in the administration, they just run their mouths constantly. Whatever pops into their tiny little minds, they just say that shit out loud. But I heard that somebody wants to do away with Veterans Day and create what is called Victory Day. Well, I've already said that I think the current occupant of the White House, has zero respect for the military. But this is just an affirmation that anybody with any power in the federal government would suggest doing away with Veterans Day. Which, by the way, is interesting that I'm saying this, because I don't really care that much for Veterans Day. There aren't that many veterans, and this is kind of a tacit acknowledgement that there aren't many veterans, and veterans don't really matter, right? Like, veterans groups clearly don't matter. But the interesting kind of twist to this is that we're going to call it Victory Day, and I'm like, what victory exactly are we talking about? Because we just this month celebrated VE Day, right? The 80th anniversary of VE Day, which stands for Victory in Europe, over the Nazis and I guess the Italians, right? The Germany surrendered. But that's the last victory, right? Like, we're still, the Korean Peninsula is still technically in a state of war. That wasn't something we, quote, won. I don't think anybody that's objective can say that we, quote, won the Vietnam War. I know there are a lot of guys out there that'll be like, oh, we never lost an engagement with the North Vietnamese Army or the Viet Cong. Okay, fine, but wars are won not by killing the other side, but also by achieving strategic objectives. We certainly didn't do that. If the domino theory was a valid theory, well, that domino fell. And by the way, that country's still communist. I don't know if you want to say we lost, but we certainly didn't win. And then if I fast forward to wars that happened like when I was around, in the military, or after I was in the military, I guess the first Gulf War you would call a victory, during George H.W. Bush's presidency. But certainly, the campaigns, the, quote, global war on terror, or as I like to call it, the war on an ideology, mixed results there. I have zero. There's nothing I can point to that we accomplished in Iraq. except we still have troops there, and it's been, what, 22 years now, over 22 years, because that war started in March of 2003. Afghanistan, everybody criticized Biden pulling us out of Afghanistan, but it's like, when were we going to leave? You know, I mean, I guess we could have still been there, but what's the point? The Taliban controls the country just like they did on September 10th, 2001. You know, yeah, Osama bin Laden was killed, but basically that was, you know, a special warfare operation in a country not called Afghanistan, not called Iraq. So I don't know where the victories are. But then again, a lot of republics that are, you know, in their waning days will point to things that seem like victories that are clearly not, you know. So anyway, let's talk about Werner. So Werner just announced, they announced a few things, and the first thing that kind of piqued my interest was they announced that they are not going to do any matching in their 401k plan. So now if you put money in their 401k plan, if you're one of their employees, Werner is not going to give you one stinking dime of matching funds. And the reason that bothers me so much is because I've talked about the fact that there are these costs, these fees, these frictional costs to 401k plans, and oftentimes, most of the time, those fees are borne by the plan participants. In other words, you put your money in, you put $1 in from your own pocket, right? From your pre-tax earnings, you put $1 in, and then what happens is a portion of that dollar goes to pay the plan custodian. Okay? And so, yeah, your money grows tax-free, but, you know, you got to make up for the fact that there are these fees in these plans that you're covering. So whatever gain you have has to overcome both, you know, has to get around the market, right? So you have to have gains, but you have to have gains enough to cover that cost before you even show any appreciation in your portfolio. But when companies match, and especially if they have a decent match, like I've talked about GP Transco's, it was like basically, it was essentially 80%. It was essentially 4% if you put in 5%. So it was 80% of the first 5% you put in. Not a bad match, you know, the fees would have been covered, etc. The company I'm at now, Bowman, their match is only 2%. I think it's too low. And other companies, you know, they say, oh, you're not eligible for the 401k until you've been here for a year. And that's the reason for that is that 401ks vest immediately. So the second they put $1 in to like match your, say, $10, that dollar is gone from them. They can't have it back. Even if you leave the next week, you keep the dollar. So Werner said, oh, well, we're cutting costs. But really what they need to say is they're cutting compensation for all their rank and file employees. Now, the guy that runs Werner, the CEO, is a guy named Derek Leathers. And no, that is not his porn star name. That's his actual name. And last year, well, in 2023, he made right around close to like $4.5 million, we'll say. And a lot of that compensation came as stock. And I'll tell you why in a second that actually is a bigger deal than you might think, the stock part. So I'm sure that, a company that last year reported that they earned $3 billion, they can't possibly cut costs anywhere to get the $40 million in savings that they've told the markets. And by the way, Werner Enterprises is a publicly traded company, and they announced that they were basically screwing their employees today, and guess what? Their stock price was up. And I'll tell you why that's important in a second. So Werner is like, oh, we got to save $40 million. Well, I think there are lots of places that they could probably save at Werner, but screwing over employees shouldn't be their first choice. But yet, the markets typically do love it when companies screw over employees, when companies lay piles of people off, when they cut compensation. But you notice, I didn't see anything in the press release about Derek Leather's compensation getting cut. I mean, and I don't know what Werner's 401k plan looked like. I don't care if it was like 0.25%, match on the first 1%. Some de minimis tiny amount that you couldn't possibly make it any lower and still meet the safe harbor provisions. I don't care what it was. They took it away from their employees. So if you work at Werner, if you're a company driver at Werner, and there's any other place that'll hire you, you should quit today and take a job elsewhere. If you're a mechanic, if you're a payroll person, if you take the trash out at Werner, I don't care what your job is, today you should start looking for a new job, because your company said, we just don't give a fuck about you. We don't care. And by the way, the 401k is an easy cut to make, but bet the last dollar you got, that's not the end of it. They're gonna find ways to reduce other benefit costs to their for their employees. So if you get medical insurance, don't be surprised if your premiums go up if the company covers less than they used to, which probably isn't very much anyway, just so they can keep their investors happy. Now, I mentioned Derek Leathers, not a porn star name, and his stock options. And by the way, I'm sure that there are a bunch of people that on the board of directors, senior executives that are all getting stock in Werner as part of their compensation. But here's where it gets really interesting, because also today, in addition to announcing they were fucking their employees over, Werner announced that they are going to have a dividend for this quarter, and it's going to be 14 cents per share. Okay, which doesn't sound like a lot, but when you have millions and millions of shares outstanding, it's a big deal. But this is what I want. This is what I want to point out about that, right? So let's say that the CEO, and by the way, again, the stock price went up today. It was up like 27 basis points, so 0.27%, which doesn't sound like a lot, like I said about the 14 cents, but it really is, because you think about it, that's a 1 day, 27 hundredths of a percent gain in just 1 day. So it's significant. And here's where it really starts to add up. So let's say that Derek Leathers, not a porn star name, by the way, just happens to hold, I don't know, 1 million shares of Werner. And I don't know if that's how many shares he holds, but let's just use that number as a for example, right? Well, if he owns 1 million shares, right, and that stock was up 10 cents today on this announcement, then that would mean that just today he made $10,000, or he had $10,000 appreciation in his portfolio. Now, that wouldn't be realized unless he sold the stock. But here's the other interesting thing about the dividend announcement. So they announced that their dividend is 14 cents a share. Let's say he owns 1 million shares of stock. And when I say own, I don't mean own like he bought the stuff, more like own like it's being given to him. And I just don't think Werner is that successful a company, but as far as, like rewarding people. But in any event, let's just say that he has 1 million shares of stock and they declare a 14-cent dividend. That means when that dividend is paid, he will make $14,000, if my math is correct. So, when you're driving for Werner, and the last time I talked to a Werner driver when I was at GP Transco, and that driver, because I've never run into many of their drivers, but she was running dry van. She'd already been with the company for 6 months, and she was making like 36 cents a mile. I can't imagine that people at Werner are, making 70 cents a mile, like lots of them are. But, it just goes to show you that this country and our economy is predicated on screwing over the working class for the enrichment of people that are already insanely wealthy. And don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that running a big company isn't a big deal. It is. There are responsibilities. But when you're getting paid, $4.5–5 million a year, and you can't figure out a better way to run your company than by impressing Wall Street, by just, screwing over your employees, then I got a problem with the fact that you make that much salary. I think you're grossly overpaid. I think you suck at your job, and and people will say, oh, well, that guy's successful because he makes all that. Well, my response to that is I could show you example after example after example of people basically failing up. I was talking about I talked about the situation with Forward Air, how they hired all these disgraceful executives that had been at Yellow. I mean, what else? What's a bigger example of failing up? I mean, there's thousands of them. We all know managers that suck at their jobs and then get promoted, and act like they don't suck at their jobs. Again, if you are a company employee, if you are a W-2 employee at Werner who is participating in that 401k plan, take whatever money you got there and go to a different company, right? Go to a different company that at least, maybe they don't have a huge payout in their 401k, maybe they don't have a huge match. But when a company says we're taking away the match, the pittance that we were giving you because we don't have a pension plan, we don't have a retirement, we'll just toss you a few crumbs when you put in your hard-earned money. If you want to stay with that company, then you deserve whatever you get. Because mark my words, they're going to do more. If Wall Street doesn't think they've cut costs enough, they're going to keep doing things to pay a dividend. And by the way, when a dividend gets paid, it's the company giving money to shareholders, right? Now, I buy dividend paying stocks because I want that money. But I hope, and I do pay attention to this, I don't want to invest in companies that screw over their employees. I want to invest in companies that are well run, have good products, and happy employees. You know, because it turns out those companies typically tend to continue making money and can pay a dividend, etc., without screwing over their employees. So anyway, I appreciate everybody. If I don't talk to you between now and then, have a good weekend. Be safe. Have an honorable Memorial Day. I never say happy when I talk about that holiday, but have an honorable Memorial Day. And just to reiterate, if you work at Werner, spend this weekend getting your resume looking good and go somewhere else. If you're a driver, get on 10th Street and shotgun a bunch of applications out. Werner, if you got a few months experience and you haven't put a truck in the ditch when you've been at Werner and you're not in the clearinghouse, screw them back and take your efforts elsewhere, because they're not trying to do anything for you. You shouldn't try to do anything for them. So anyway, again, have a good weekend, and I'll talk to you soon. Bye.